So, hello everyone, and welcome to the first talk in the 2026 Voices in Vegan Studies speaker series organized by Arihanta Institute. My name is Jonathan Dickstein. I am the Tirthankara Sharayansanath Endowed Assistant Professor of Jain and Vegan Studies at Arihanta, and I'm also the lead organizer for our Vegan Studies Initiative. Now, for those who don't know, the Vegan Studies Initiative at Arihanta launched in 2024, and it is an online program across different areas and different medium that are focused on promoting and enacting veganism as an expression of multi-species nonviolence. The initiative includes graduate level academic training, live and self-paced online courses, public conferences and guest speaker events such as this, and global partnerships with aligned organizations. Our Voices in Vegan Studies speaker series, now in its second year, has two main goals. One, to bring influential work in vegan studies into conversation with the Jain community and scholars of Jainism. And two, to introduce broader audiences to the ways Jain philosophy and practice meaningfully connect with contemporary veganism. The series participants in our first series and in 2026 come from a wide array of backgrounds because at Arihanta, we understand vegan studies as an interdisciplinary field that brings together animal studies, food studies, race studies, gender studies, environmental studies, and many other related areas of inquiry. So with that said, I really am thrilled to host the inaugural talk of 2026 with Dr. Yamini Narayanan. The talk today is titled Traumas of Elephant Conservation, State Discipline, Wildness, and Kumki Elephants in Assam. Dr. Narayanan is an Australian Research Council Future Fellow and Associate Professor of International Development at Deakin University, Melbourne. She is the author of the multi-award-winning Mother Cow, Mother India. Her current research focuses on animals in coercive labor in illegal production chains, particularly in India's construction sector. She is currently studying how animals shape, subvert, and surrender to geopolitics in South Asian borderlands. She is a lifelong fellow of the Oxford Center for Animal Ethics, an honor that is conferred through nomination or invitation only. Before I turn it over to Yamini, I would like to let you all know that you can chat. You can use the chat function during the talk to kind of just share reflections or maybe some general kind of feelings or something you didn't know. But we also have a Q&A box that is dedicated specifically for questions for us to get into at the end of the talk. I'll also might drop things as we go in the chat, kind of links that may come up. But by and large, feel free to engage with both the chat and the question and answer function. So, Yamini, thank you so much for being here today. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me again, Jonathan. And it's such an honor, honestly, to be speaking. This is the first talk that I'm actually delivering from my newest and my most baby project. So I am really pleased to do it. Pleased that this is, with you and with the Arihanta Institute. Shall I share my PowerPoint?
Yes, that would be wonderful.
Let me just get started on that. Does that come through clearly enough?
It is. Looks great.
Okay. Okay, great. So I'd like to begin today by acknowledging the Munawina people of the Nipulana lands that I find myself in what we call Hobart today. As members of the educational community, we are really obligated to know the histories of dispossession that are part of our work, that are part of our reflections, and to be continuously in reflection and in accountability ourselves about the consequences and impacts of dispossession, something which is truly aligned with my talk today. So, for those of you who are familiar with my talk, familiar with my work, you'd know that for more than a decade, now coming on to almost 15 years, I have been working on domesticated animals, specifically bovines and also currently equines, camels, that are used in India's construction sector. So it was very recent. It is really very recently that I have started to sort of get into India's relationships with its so-called wild species, specifically along India's international borders, because a lot of my work, as some of you might know, is actually on the interconnections between how animals shape national politics in India. And it also seemed to me a logical sort of next step in my research to think about how animals are embroiled and enmeshed in India's international politics. I mean, all animals and all nations really with geopolitical borders, human imposed geopolitical borders, um, feature animals as part of their relations, their international standing, their political recognition, and their ideas of sovereignty are very closely entwined with animals' movements and mobilities. So I ended up first in Assam, which shares an international border with Bangladesh as well as with Bhutan, right? This was day 2 of my research. And I was working with these people, sorry, and I find myself face to face with this baby elephant, a 1 month old baby elephant who 3 days later, 72 hours later, was to die in my arms. And I'd like to start with considering what is it that actually makes it possible for a social sciences researcher 2 days into the field, a complete novice in the arena of wildlife studies. I'm beginning to feel like a bit of a fraud, like trying to figure out how I can make my way in, trying to understand the logistics of working with so-called wild species. And I repeatedly say so-called wild species because we all understand that domesticated animals are formally sovereign, right? And domestication is a process of removing their wildness or taking away their wildness. 2 days into my research, I was accompanying a wildlife vet who was also who was looking after this very large national park, which borders India and Bhutan, called the Manas National Park. On one side is, Manas, which is in India, and the other side is Royal Manas, which becomes Bhutan, right? And of course, the entire ecosystem of Manas, as far as the animals that animate these sort of landscapes. I mean, it's just one big ecology, but of course, there's a big geopolitical border, and by South Asian standards, it's a friendly border as well, right? And how does it come to be that we find this elephant, an abandoned elephant calf, a seemingly abandoned elephant calf, which is it's almost on a weekly basis that you get to see these calves, suddenly so-called abandoned wildlife calves. And this was how we the vet clearly had a phone call that this calf was abandoned, so to speak. Abandoned is again a very, very problematic term. And we went to find this and I thought, oh, we're going to look at a wild, because I didn't really understand or know the logistics of who we were going to see. And it turns out to be a 1 month old baby. Now, just to give you a sense of how absolutely difficult it is, and this was how we actually found him when we first saw him, right? Heavily injured. Um, and just to give you a sense of the impossibility, actually, of ever being able to go anywhere near a 1 month old calf. Elephant herds are matriarchal herds. They're not just made, they are headed by a matriarch. But elephant calves are quite literally at the center, quite literally at the gravitational physical center of herds. They're looked after not only by their mother, but because it's understood that the mothers are recovering from delivery and the mothers themselves are in physical recovery, some of the most ferocious carers of elephants are their aunties, right? So, and then of course there's the bulls who are also very, very responsible guardians of the herd. And then the sub-adult males who are about 10 years old, who are beginning to learn how to guard the herd. So the long and short of it is actually impossible to get to a 1 month old elephant calf, right? It's actually physically impossible. It is, and and yet, as I was saying, on a weekly basis, it is common to find these calves constantly abandoned, constantly sort of isolated from their herd. And how does that come to be? And this entire question of this elephant calf was then, what happened to this elephant calf? And I'm just to go back and show you what that wound was. Initially, it was, the vet thought, oh, this could be a tiger bite. But and we kept thinking, no, this is not a tiger bite, because it's impossible for a tiger. It would be a very, very foolish tiger to try and get to a calf, and that to the center of the herd. It would logically make sense that a tiger gets to A tiger would probably go for a calf, especially if it's a hungry mother tigress herself. However, to actually get to a calf is a physical impossibility for the tiger herself. So what had actually happened was that there are snares, and the baby elephant had basically gotten into a snare, and the snare was strong enough that, as you can see here, it actually broken. The had broken. The bone, the bone had physically broken. There was just literally nothing left of the calf. And the calf, and it was filled with maggots. The calf had been in this state of suffering for about an estimated, just by the looking at the wound, for about an estimated a week or 10 days already. Maggots, it wasn't just maggots, it was these huge forest sticks that was inside the wound of the calf. Absolute state of extraordinary agony. The calf was brought to this guest house where I was staying, and I just actually assumed that there might be some type of veterinary hospital. I was only in day 2 of my research. Turns out absolutely no, no veterinary facilities whatsoever. Assam is one of India's large elephant states, right? There was nothing. They started to treat the maggots, and and I was wondering, why is it not possible to just euthanize when there is absolutely no facilities available and this elephant calf was in such state of suffering? With the milk that he was getting was, heavily watered down glaxo powder, which is, like human milk formula, which was heavily watered, heavily watered. So he was barely getting any type of nutrition. And I kept trying to sort of understand why weren't they euthanizing, and then of course it took me a while because the vet wasn't very good at explaining right away that it's actually impossible. First of all, Indians generally as a culture are very reluctant to euthanize, something that often frustrates me while on field work. But it's also really difficult to euthanize, and UNESCO designated conservation protected, like critical of the Asian elephant is designated highly endangered, not yet critically endangered, but highly endangered. It's really difficult to euthanize an endangered animal because conservation reports want to see the elephant numbers go up. They don't want to see the elephant numbers go down. So, right. So here we have this really tricky situation where you're confronted by the politics of conservation, which requires you, for the sake of funding, for the sake of showing sort of responsible conservation modes and mechanisms of practice, is that you see the numbers go up, and there's absolutely no way of demonstrating any type of care, which euthanasia might be a part. And progressively, there was just this, this is not a normal elephant sitting posture. And I was trying to document, like, the ways in which he was just demonstrating extraordinary, profound pain. And of course, but 3 days later, and I, begged and begged the vet, and he finally agreed to euthanize. I might have probably bought the elephant. The calf was dying, and I might have probably bought him 5 to 7 hours. Like, it just didn't seem like I had brought him much time at all. I was in this baby elephant camp because I came across, before I met this baby elephant, we had come to do some type of a reconnaissance trip. And I came across these 3 baby elephants, right? And they're all between the age of 6 months to 18 months. They all look the same size because they're all undernourished. And again, it took me a while to recognize the signs of undernourishment, and the vet would point out why they were undernourished in the skeletal framework. And elephants lactate from their mothers for about 2 to 3 years. It's a mutual decision between the mother and child, as with any mammal, as to when lactation stops. But these elephants were, yeah, as I said, between six, one was 6, one was 9 months old, one was about 18 months old. And they were all again found at the age of 1 month, seemingly abandoned by their herd. And I wanted to sort of, I was staying in a guest house quite literally right opposite this little camp. And I wanted to understand what happens, first of all, the reasons for so-called elephant abandonment from these herds, from their herds, which are extraordinarily protective. So what is it that actually separates, what drives such baby calves to be separated from their herds? And then what is the future life worlds of these calves, right? I mean, what does it mean for a calf to live, what does an adult life look like for a calf that is so heavily imprinted on humans from such a young age because they recognize their individual mahouts as their mothers, right? And that's a whole different story about the life worlds of the mahouts themselves and the ways in which they are unable to, bureaucratically, things that come in the way for them to be unable to deliver care. But I was, so this was really important for me to try and understand what their life worlds look like and how they actually would it be possible for them to, did the state have, because they were endangered species, they were supposed to be protected in the wild, what sort of mechanisms was in place to, rewild them, what rewilding them might even look like. What was it that, what these processes look like and what does it, and especially because these calves were born, were taken, were absorbed into human communities, which would be an impossible situation normally. It would never ever happen in the wilderness. So what that actually looked like. And so these were calves, which was, it was very interesting to observe their relationship because they were in some ways, which was a very unnatural herd to have a herd of just infants, and each of them was an infant. One of them was still bottle feeding. In fact, all of them should be bottle feeding, but because there was just one mahout to look after three of them, he just this youngest one, just the 6-month-old one alone was being bottle fed, and of course the other two would just scream and cry. But the minute they start being able to consume any solids, the bottle feeding instantly stops, right? And or what they get, because Assam is a very, very big banana state, all they get is basically banana leaves and banana trunks. And exclusively, in fact, all elephants, even the older elephants, but also the baby elephants, exclusively on a diet of banana. And I would observe their dung, because it was so fibrous, their diet was so fibrous, it would actually take about an hour to fall. And a few things really struck me about this research as compared to my previous research, because my previous research, I was constantly encountering calves, for example, from the dairy industry, or foals who were born into the construction industry. But in the course of that type of research, I would go to field sites and I wouldn't necessarily see those individual calves or foals again. In this particular research, it was an absolute fact that I would be encountering these calves constantly, right? And the thing about these, about elephant calves is this. I mean, like there's a lot in the literature about how they are gorgeous and goofy when they're young and they're cute and they have an extraordinary. It's actually quite incredible. They have an extraordinary resemblance to human behavior, and which is one reason why humans also get emotionally embroiled with elephant lives. The way they, even though they're physiologically couldn't be different to humans, the way they sit, the way they stand, the way they interact with each other, the way they use their trunks, the way they throw tantrums, or what we can imagine as tantrums, is extraordinarily akin to human childlike behavior when it comes to the calves. So there's this certain goofiness and there's a certain type of relationship that is very possible when they're this physically small in size. While they're still young, but nonetheless starting to become bigger, so a 4-year-old calf is already very difficult for a human to manage because of the sheer size. They're already about 200, 300 kilos at that point. Um, and as Laurie Hamilton talks about in her work, they become a little bit more opinionated. Their trunks are harder to control, and that's when the relationship begins to change. If this when this elephant is in captivity or in incarcerated life worlds along with humans, then it becomes necessary to control them at any given time, right? And I was really interested in what happens to these elephants. I mean, because I assumed that because these elephants were actually sent to a national park would surely, their first priority, their only priority would be to sort of rewild them in some ways, to amalgamate them with wild elephant herds or with semi-wild elephant herds in some way. It's a national park. It is not a circus. It is not, a timber company or a construction labor company, which might still use elephants. There are a lot of elephants in captivity that are used for a whole range of purposes in Assam, despite this being largely illegal. There are loopholes in the law that allow commercial use of elephants. But I was convinced in the early stages of research that surely inside a national park, because these elephants were being looked after inside a national park, it would be different. And that's when I came to understand that these elephants would also undergo training being a euphemism for a process of extraordinary violence when they were about 5 years old. And at 5 years old, they're still children. Elephants, like humans, live to about 80 years old. So in fact, unlike most other animals, we can actually find some type of parallel between human life stages and elephant life stages. At 5 years old, they're very much still babies. They're not even sub-adults yet, right? So these elephants, these baby elephants that I was going to see several months of every year, were going to become what are called kumki elephants. They were going to become trained to become kumki elephants. Now, kumki elephants are a category of elephants that are very unique to Asia, right? Um, Kumki elephants are captive elephants that are trained for a spectrum of purposes, but one of their most important contemporary purposes is to aid in their own conservation. And I'll get into a minute about what that means. So, so these three elephants, and I spent a lot of time with these elephants, and they were playful, they were babies. Um, what struck me was any amount of separation, even from within each other, even though they'd have their little sparring between each other, if they were separated from each other, their anxiety would go through the roof, right? And of course, if they were going to become trained, that separation was going to be inevitable. Before I get into what Kumki elephant actually means, I'd like to think a little bit about what is it that produces this type of, this rate of abandoned elephant calves. The national park receives about 1 to 2 to 3 um, abandoned calves on a weekly basis, almost, right? From throughout the state, sometimes from other states as well, because elephants are long ranging. So we need to understand that, before geopolitical borders came into place, elephants from India, for example, would go into Bangladesh, into Bhutan, into Southeast Asia, into Cambodia, into Thailand. So these are extraordinarily long-ranging elephants, ranging animals. They would sometimes stay, and then likewise, elephants from those areas would come all the way into South Asia, right? So they are long-ranging, but then they would then, there's this rate of elephants, 2 or 3 elephants coming through every week, and there's several important reasons, and this really comes into play when we think about a species that is noted as highly endangered, as potentially getting into the critically endangered category, and the threat of extinction in the wild is real. There's extinction in the wild, and there's extinction in captivity, but the extinction in wild is very real. So one of the things that becomes a big factor is, as I said, these are long-ranging animals, and then there's geopolitical borders. The India-Bhutan border, which is where the Manas National Park is located, is, as I said, one of the friendliest borders, right? It's an open border as far as humans are concerned. So there's free movement of humans back and forth. But an interesting thing is beginning to happen where elephant corridors are in place. So where elephant corridors are actually ancestral corridors that elephants have typically used through through a very long intergenerational ancestral history. Now, elephants have profoundly, amazingly big brains and a sense and a memory that is actually intergenerational. It is not just memories that emerge within their own lifespans, within their own individual lifespans, but it is believed to be intergenerationally inherited. So when an elephant corridor, for example, that has been used for hundreds of years is disrupted, contemporary modern day elephant herds will still try and find that corridor. So to disrupt an elephant corridor is traumatic. It is disruptive of an animal whose survival, whose flourishing does depend on ranging. So along the India-Bhutan border, which is still a friendly border, nonetheless, you will find fences like these, which are along elephant corridors, right? And this has been In this case, this has been put by Bhutan. So you will find these fences. And I thought, oh, they were just badly built fences. But then these fences are intentionally built in a way that actually leans towards India in this case. On the other side, as you can see, it's one contiguous ecosystem. It's one contiguous ecology, but the fences are leaning towards India. So what this means is when it comes to elephants, these are not electric fences, and there are electric fences along many sides of many areas of the border. But here, an elephant herd which is proceeding from India towards Bhutan is actually going to find it hard to press down on these fences. If a fence was erect, they could actually press down on the fence and the fence would fall towards the Bhutan side. If a fence is actually leaning towards the India side, elephants will find it harder to actually press down on a fence that is leaning towards them. So it's actually quite ingenious if you want to prevent the elephants from going that way. So you'll find these kind of fences for long stretches of kilometers along elephant corridors, right? So you can see that they're actually intentionally built this way, and an elephant might actually find it quite hard. Of course, in many places, elephants are problem solvers. They're constantly trying to figure out what to do. Their brains are extraordinary. So in many corridors, they actually have found a way of smashing these fences. But in other cases, these have working fairly effectively. But it's not just internal borders. It's not just, geopolitical borders. Geopolitical borders are, of course, a big problem. But there's also borders within the country, district borders, state borders. So, for example, as habitats reduce, and humans people actually admit that we have taken their land away. Where are they going to go? So they admit that. But at the same time, there's the reality that these lands have now become agricultural fields. And now elephants have become rogue elephants. They've become crop raiders because they come out of the forest. There is really virtually no food left in the forest. There's no water left in the forest. They will come out of the forests. In fact, we could say that they are in the forest that has been converted into agricultural land, right? So the state of Assam, for example, will try and push the elephants into the state of Arunachal Pradesh within India, and Arunachal Pradesh will do the same thing back. So the elephants are constantly being chased from one state to another. They're also being chased from one district to another. So every state is divided into different districts, and different bureaucrats and different officials and different forest departments are responsible for different districts. Okay. Now I have a particular district. I don't want the elephants coming into my district because then the villagers are going to complain. It's going to become a big problem. First of all, there's going to be crop raiding. Then there could be human deaths. A human death is going to, be a disproportionately huge problem in terms of, just the bureaucracy, the time that it takes, the rage against the elephants, the violence that the elephant herds will retributively receive back. So if I'm a bureaucrat in charge of an elephant of a district, I'm going to do everything I possibly can to make sure the elephants go away from my district into the neighboring district, and the neighboring district is going to do the same thing back. So these elephants on a nightly basis are being chased from one district to another by the forest department themselves. But then there's also this interesting and very little remarked upon case of youth frustration and youth anger, male youth frustration and male youth anger, right? And we talk about this because, prior to my coming into animal studies, I used to work on human-based issues before, particularly with regards to violence against women, again, something which India has a very dubiously strong reputation for. Um, and there's a lot in the human feminist literature about male youth frustration, male youth unemployment. And it was really sort of visceral to see the way that this unfolds into playing a role in potential elephant extinction, right? So one of the things that happens on a nightly basis, because district officials and forest departments will make an intentional bureaucratic decision to either chase the elephants, so to speak, back into the forest, or they'll say these elephants don't belong to this district. They belong to your district, so you take them back. Okay, so elephants are suddenly being caught in administrative borders and in bureaucratic borders. But what happens at night on a daily basis? And night times are really important for elephants because that is when elephants actually are spend a lot of time sleeping during the day. So the nighttime is really important for them to be, foraging for food, right? So this is the time when they forage for food, and this is the time when they are chased by oftentimes unemployed, disgruntled, disillusioned male youth who are, there's so much in terrorism studies, for example, or counterterrorism studies about how this proportion, this demography of the population, um, is sort of waiting capital to perpetuate regimes of terror in within human realms, but also within the case of wild animals, right? So here, and just going to show you a very quick video of what happens with these elephant herds. And this was a photo that was. I should acknowledge one of the activists called Sangeeta Dakia, who works in Golpara district in Assam. This video was taken on her phone, and then she passed it on to me. So this was a sub-adult elephant and a sub-adult male. Now, sub-adult males often will get ejected from their natal herds because they are meant to form herds of their own, form little herds, and then they usually go into other herds to be trained to be responsible adult males looking after their herds. So they are for several years. Once a sub-adult male is ejected from his natal herd, these elephants will actually spend a fair bit of time on their own, right? So this was a sub-adult male who was trying to figure out his life world. And these are hordes of village youth who will quite literally try and chase these elephants. And they call it spotlighting, right? It reminds me in some ways of Nazi detention camps where, you quite literally spotlight these elephants who are they're actually quite, generally quite peaceful, generally just minding their own business. And this can actually startle and lead to a lot of human animal, what they call human animal conflict when this happens in full scale herds. So as what happens here, as what happens here, for example, right? Oh, sorry. So this is an elephant herd trying to make its way into a forest. So this is called spotlighting, and they will quite so village men will actually, the men, these young men, and you will literally never find a woman in these sorts of crowds, yeah, that are chasing the elephants. Exclusively 100% recorded, so to speak, so far are exclusively a male youth. And they'll often have they call it playing football. So they literally try and chase the elephants. And I'm going to chase the elephant from this village to that village. So they will spend the entire night chasing these elephants. And when they are entire herds, and I've seen videos of elephants getting really startled, really agitated, and in this kind of confusion, it is very common then for the youngest of the herd, which is a month-old baby, who's unable to keep up with with the speed required, and oftentimes they'll just get separated, and they'll just literally fall on the fields, and then they are unable to trace they haven't learned the skills. Of course, they are unable to trace their natal herd again, right? Sometimes the natal herd comes back, but oftentimes it is too late because then this baby elephant is already captured. This is spotlighting. Other ways of absolutely really tormenting the elephants is that, they will oftentimes they will oftentimes sit waiting on trees, and then they'll take these cycle tires, which are burning cycle tires, and throw them on the backs of the elephants. These backs, because they're rounded backs, the burning cycle tire, the rubber tire, will actually just stay. There's no way for an elephant to be able to shake it off because of the rounded back. Bullets, bombs, it's quite literally everything that is possible to use, and these are like, locally made bombs, like so to speak, like firecrackers. So they are extraordinarily loud. So they will add particular combinations of chemicals, so they make extraordinarily loud, right? So entire elephant herds, conservationists will tell you, in Assam or in West Bengal, which are strong elephant states, literally every herd has injuries. Now, when every herd has injuries, you can imagine the state of vigilance and the state of trauma that these elephants are constantly in, which leads to greater levels of conflict. Now, there's no time for me to get into that here, but a lot of elephants will actually, there's a lot to be said about elephants' capacities or their intentionalities for taking revenge on humans, which also speaks the idea of taking revenge, you know, and it's an interesting path to go down on, because there seems to be evidence that elephants are absolutely capable of remembering and retaliating. It also speaks, of course, to their intelligence. Um, so when elephants are captured, either because they are babies or because one of them turns rogue, one of them turns a killer elephant, one of them becomes a terrorist elephant. These things are very common. So oftentimes what will happen is that wild elephants are captured because they have turned rogue, or baby elephants are, of course, are captured as well, right? So who we are seeing here is a kumki elephant who has been trained, and you can see the mahout having a bullhook. And you'll find these elephants in Assam, like single elephants dotted through Manas National Park, and they look like elephants from a distance, and then you go closer, you see the chains, and then you realize these are kumkis, and I'll come to kumkis in a second. Now, this is a kumki elephant, a male elephant in must, which is their hormonal, mating period, where they are normally looking for a mate. So they're seen as being in a heightened state of aggression by humans, right? Now, in the wild, must might actually last for as long as just one day, because as soon as the elephant finds a mate, he's able to come out of his must. Sometimes it'll take longer if he's not a dominant elephant. If he's a more submissive elephant, it might take a bit longer, but it lasts, from a few days to a few weeks to maybe a month or so if it's not a dominant elephant. In Under captivity, must will last up to a year because they are unable to find their mates, right? And here again, it's really interesting while talking to veterinarians about what does the training process look like. These are all elephant veterinarians. These are all national park veterinarians, and they'll talk. Every single vet will demonstrably like show signs of nervousness. Their legs start shaking. They have hands start tapping on their tables. When they start talking about what elephant training looks like, you can see the elephant in the middle actually having a bull hook just hooked on her ear. So the process of turning an elephant into a kumki elephant, I actually have some photos of Kumki elephants, but they were taken from so far away they weren't very clear. So I've actually taken just some photos from the internet. Um, the Kumki elephants are trained are they in what are called kraals to braid them. Kraals are these long bamboo. These are highly enclosed. In fact, these are much roomier than what they actually are. They are so highly enclosed that they are quite literally squeezing the elephant in from all ends. They're squeezing the elephant in. The elephant is their knees are constantly tortured, beaten, poked. They're speared constantly. They are starved for a good 1 month to break them. By the end of this breaking in process, an elephant is so traumatized that if you whistle in front of the elephant, they'll start cowering. right? This is also the process of breaking in an elephant into a kraal and to remake them as kumkis also is a process of training for the mahout themselves. This is and what the mahout undergoes actually tells you a lot about what the elephant undergoes. So it's a 24-hour training process. So they have to beat the elephant continuously for about 2 hours, and it is such physical labor that they say that they are exhausted, they are in pain, they are sweating so badly, and 2 hours later there'll be a shift in the switch, and of course the elephant gets no break. This is a continuous process of breaking in the elephant. But it's really interesting to talk about the mahout's experience of the physicality of training on themselves, because that really gives you an insight. And this kind of kraal training of kumkis is a pre-colonial process. In pre-colonial India, these were trained to, elephants were broken in this manner to be part of the king's army, and they continued on through the colonial times. But once the Wildlife Protection Act comes into place, what is really profoundly unique about the contemporary situation that these are happening to protected animals, protected conservation listed animals inside national parks. So this process of training is brutal. Like for example, this position that the elephant is in, he will quite literally be in this position for hours, probably an entire day. Right. And of course the mahout will have their shifts, but they will literally be in these and this is just one amongst many type of positions and of breaking them in. And now these are, oftentimes, so when they are wild elephants that are captured because they're crop raiders or they're rogues or they're killer elephants, the wild elephants go through this, but so do the babies, including those 3 babies that I am now invested in, and that I've been like, they're going to be there. I'm seeing them all. I get weekly updates. I get texts about these babies, right? And so this became a very personal project because I just thought, what can be done to ensure that this is not the fate of these babies, because as soon as they become a little bit stronger, a little bit bigger, as soon as they become 4 or 5 years old, this is what looks like their future. And the interesting thing is that the forest department actually encourages breeding of elephants, because you'll have these kumkis, female kumkis, for example. If they're female kumkis, they are tied, they are bound, but then the forest department lets the male elephants, the wild male elephants, come and breed with them, right? So you constantly also have elephants that are born into captivity. And the interesting thing is that when it is time to train these baby elephants that are born into captivity, it's also called capture, because while the mother is trained and broken, when the time comes to separate her from her calf, all of her wildness completely comes forth, right? So even when it comes to separating a captured calf from a captured mother, it's called capture, separating them for training. So, this kind of news is very common, where you talk about these rogue elephants are turned into kumkis, or, but then what conservation work, and I'm going to be very quick because I can see that I'm just keeping an eye on the time. The work that conservation requires of kumki elephants is that elephant territory is extremely dense. There's a huge thick canopy of forests. Elephant grass is as tall as the elephants themselves. In fact, when you look at the elephant grass, you realize that elephants, for all of their size, are not meant to be seen. Okay, when we do multi-species ethnography of domesticated animals, it is only possible because they are in a state of unfreedom. When you try and do multi-species ethnographies of so-called wild animals, all you see is traces, scat, footprints, snakeskin, feathers. You'd never actually see the actual animals unless they are in captivity, right? So elephant grass is really tall. So one of the reasons, a major reason is that, you have to be on top of an elephant to watch out for poachers. Now, certainly poaching is a big issue along the India, China, Nepal, Bangladesh, Bhutan border for sure. But then elephants are used to be used in anti-poaching activities, so for their own conservation. Elephants are used to move strayed wild elephants back into the forest. So wild elephants are actually really scared of kumkis. Now, kumkis, one has to understand, is actually not just the elephant, it is the human-elephant hybrid. Okay, so when a human is seated on top of the elephant, that's the kumki elephant. It's a hybrid, right? So wild elephants see a kumki, that is a domesticated captive elephant with a human on top, and they run because they know to run. That's the sensible thing to do, right? When you see a kumki elephant because of the human that's sitting on top. Now, Kumki elephants are so broken, and this is one of those haunting images that lasts in my head. There's the story of, and just, I'm going to be wrapping up here. This is the story of Mohan that I want to end with. So Mohan, I asked the field director, what can be done? Why don't you rewild these elephants? Like, why don't you actually, why is it that they have to go through the process of becoming kumkis? And he said, 10 or 15 years ago, I would have considered this. But he said, now there is no forest. Where am I going to send them back? There is literally nowhere to send them back to, right? So necessarily they are captured. They live a life of captivity inside the national park, and it is really intensive captivity, and they are trained to become kumkis. So this was the story of Mohan, who as a 5-year, who was also found as a 1-month-old elephant. When he was 5 or 7, they tried to rewild him. They took him from Kaziranga National Park, which is where he was originally found, into Manas, which is within the same state. And they tried to sort of release these elephants, the 3 of them together. What happened was that because they were so heavily imprinted on humans from the age of 1 month, they kept coming back into human territory. They kept coming back into, where the guards were, for example, or where because all the national parks have, throughout national parks, you'll find these forest guards, these little towers with forest guards, or these little, housing for forest guards. And they kept coming back, or they kept trying to get back into human territory because that's where they were used to. That's where, they were familiar with source of food being associated with these types of places. And the forest department's position was, if you cannot be fully wild, then you have to be fully captive. There is nothing that allows them on a continuum. There's no space on a continuum. But these elephants have been familiar with humans since the age of 1 month old. There is no way that they can be fully wild. They don't know how to be fully wild. They haven't lived with elephant herds. They are trying to figure out being a wild elephant entirely on their own, whereas elephants are extraordinarily good at transmitting intergenerational knowledge. They don't know how to be fully wild, right? But the bureaucratic position is you're either wild or you're captive. You cannot be an in-between elephant, right? And so Mohan and his 3 mates were recaptured. And in this particular situation where I saw him, it was so painful because he had sustained a wound, and his face, I could just tell, was swollen, even though it's a big elephant face, was swollen to the size of several watermelons. And they were plucking without anesthetic infected muscle tissue from his face. And he was taking that level of pain. And his trunk was curled up around his tusk, but that was the maximum distress that he was allowed to show, that he would show, because his pain, he was more easily able to tolerate the pain than the pain that would come from showing any type of resistance, any type of other type of discomfort, which might actually involve pushing the humans away, right? And you can see the pain in the elephant's eyes as well. So to finish up here, what does wildness or what does flourishing look like for elephants when there is only 2 options in the face of continuous persecution, in the face of continuous loss of habitat, in the face of continuous vigilance that these elephants are actually living in, right? So there is a hostility that elephants also develop towards humans. What does flourishing look like when the only 2 options available for them is to be either wild or to be captive, in an era where they're coming into closer and closer and closer contact with humans, right? And And to understand this, we have to sort of think about the nature of contemporary modern day forest departments. Colonialism, as we know, was actually born in the forests, right? The forests were the first source of wealth, the resources, the richness. It was the decimation of forests, it was the plundering of forests, it was the exploitation of forests that was sort of the mobilization, that was the engine for colonialism, just about everywhere where colonized lands are. And intertwined deeply with the ideas of wildness as savage, as barbaric, as deviant, as risky, and you control wildness. Okay, whether this extends to racialized humans, and that's a whole separate topic, but also, of course, extends to animals that are seen as also deviant because they are wild, right? And forest era institutions in India are bureaucratically, and you know, this is not unique to forest departments. This is also, there's again lots in the literature about bureaucracy in India maintaining its colonial sense of being, right? It kind of continues to function and remodel itself on colonial modes. And forest departments, of course, the birthplace of colonialism, being the forests themselves, strongly retain this sense of coloniality across many, many dimensions, but foundationally in the way that they understand wild and wilderness and the different types of life worlds that wild and non-wild are owed. Okay, so you're either wild or you're captive. And and this sense of overturning wildness becomes so important because there was a forest wildlife vet, a national park vet, who you know, in a long conversation where he started weeping because of the treatment meted out to elephants in the name of, you know, disciplining their wildness. And he said, wild people are beautiful people, right? So I think, you know, this kind of brings us back to the kind of, to answer this whole question of flourishing, the foundational anti-colonial work I've come to realize really does need to be undone in forests and in undoing ideas and conceptions and language around wildness and wilderness. But equally, something else that I have been pondering for a while when it comes to, and this was a question that I started to confront very early on when that baby elephant was euthanized in my arms, you know, that early, and what the future of this baby meant if he did manage to survive, and the future of so many other 1 month old, weeks old, 2 months old calves that are constantly being captured by the forest department, or being sent or being rescued, so to speak, by the forest department. And one, I felt like it's not a complete conversation without talking about the political value of palliation. Okay, what are the political possibilities embedded in palliation? I have often come across animal activists who will basically say things like, and you know, it's very easy to understand where they're coming from, to say, let the humans win, let all the animals die, let them go, okay, let them win. And I can understand on a day-to-day confrontation of the grief and the agony that the activists themselves go through. I can understand where they're coming from. But when I was confronted with the fact that, you know, it's not easy or it's impossible really to, for example, euthanize an elephant in need, it really brought me back to this question of the, you know, to come back to this idea of palliation and looking at it for its political possibilities. What are the political, if first of all, is the work we do palliative when it comes to this kind of tidal wave, this tsunami of it's not just indifference, but active persecution for a whole multitude of reasons. It's not just because farmers are wanting to protect their crops, but it's also because there is an entire social group that is frustrated, that is unemployed, that is disillusioned. You know, there are so many, many factors that we are confronted with that you have to, you know, you're forced to ask when you're on the field, is this work palliative? Are we moving the needle at all? And if our work is palliative, um, and what if our partners also, for example, consider their work palliative? In this case, the forest department. When the forest department field director told me I would have considered rewilding them, trying to rewild them 10, 15 years ago, but no longer. Okay, they also in some ways consider their work palliative, right? I was talking to a conservationist who said, um, who was explaining, the conservation work they do, and we have tried to achieve this in this part of Assam and this in this part of Assam, and very, very local but important achievements. And at the end of the day, at the end of, when he told me, he said, oh, but we're only buying them time. And I didn't immediately probe that sentence because there's oftentimes, during interviews, you just think, I don't want to know what lies on the other side of it. But then we continued our discussion. And then again, he said, but at the end of the day, we're only buying them time. And then I asked, well, buying whom time? And he said, we're only buying the elephants' time. They are on their way out. We are only buying their elephants' time. These are conservationists and these are elephant people who absolutely care. Crystal clear-eyed view of, what their daily life involves and what their daily responsibilities and what their daily challenges involve. We've been working on elephants for decades, and they say, we are only buying them time. So when I went back to the field official and I said, oh, this elephant conservationist said, we're only buying them time, what do you think? And he went quiet for a minute and he said, you could say the same about the forests. We are also only buying the forest time. The forests are also on their way out. So if there's no forest, where he said, I don't even actually worry about the elephants so much as I worry about the forest, because if there's the forest, the animals are fine. But if there's no forest, where are the animals going to go? Right? So it becomes really, it's not a straightforward question, but it became one that I was forced to confront. What does our response to the politics of extinction look like? Is it conservation, and in some form keeping elephant worlds alive, or is it palliation, making sure that they have an easy end, right? And again, these are very, very open-ended questions. And again, one of the ways that you try and find some answers is to look for fissures that contain possibility of the few success stories they are, trying to learn from them, trying to see if they can be enlarged. And that applies, I think, equally to conservation as it does to palliation. And I will stop here with this very last slide, where this is not elephants. This is in the middle of the river goes the geopolitical border between India and Bhutan. If you look at the left side of the screen, you will find a mother wild buffalo. And then if you look at the right side of the screen, that's her calf. Okay? They are supposedly divided by geopolitical border, except that they won't experience it as such because they are allowed, they will reunite when they both decide to reunite, right? They're just sort of resting. And basically are looking for an ecology. Ultimately, I think this kind of showed me that this is probably what we always had before human geopolitics came into place, and probably what we should be ideally aiming for, looking for. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Yamini. That was an absolutely fascinating talk, and not only that, just I think it's a field that so many people don't know about, and this has just been kind of a landmark, or actually a trademark, sorry, of your work, trademark, hallmark of your work. That is just like these kind of stories that only you're telling, and I find it to be fascinating. So, can you stop sharing your screen? I wish I knew how to
Oh, sorry.
do that.
Yes.
No, just so I could think we can have a great.
Yes.
So there are some questions. I would just like to zoom out because, a lot of the material that you shared is heart-wrenching. And I've asked you this almost probably every time we've been together. It's like, how do you do this and still have this at least apparently like stable, relatively cheery demeanor? But what before getting into that, what I do would like to ask you a question, because what I have found in animal studies is there's sometimes people who are doing very specific ethnographies, right? They're working on dogs, or they're working on cows, or they're working on pigeons, whoever, and it's wonderful, right? We're building up this kind of archive of ethnographies. But for those who aren't familiar with your work, you used to work in human oppression issues at first, right? Mostly, I think, in urban spaces, and then you're working with dogs and camels and donkeys and cows, and now elephants. And so you're one of the few researchers I know who are really kind of like amassing together so much direct experience, but then you also are so steeped in the kind of literature around animality or around the human and so on. So I'm kind of just curious, as a really broad question, like, how do you feel like it all fits together? Or like even for yourself to comprehensively understand the situation, do you think it's so necessary to be involved in all these separate sites? Or is it really just things that you find yourself drawn to and there's not much kind of deep contemplation before doing so?
Um, that's such a good question, Jonathan. Thank you, because it does seem like it does seem a little bit undisciplined and unruly and a bit deviant myself. This research in terms of not having a focused or a sustained attention. But in some ways, I would say that I have actually with the cows, for example, I spent I think close to a decade with the equines as well. This research started sometime around in 2018. So I'm
Oh, wait,
almost
let me
coming
just say, I
on.
don't mean that none of these are sustained. I mean the opposite. I mean, like you've sustained research across subjects, but so
Yeah,
many
yeah.
different. And a lot of people seem to just stay with one, right? And you've done such deep dives that are not just kind of secondary literature, but you're doing the field work and they're extremely sustained. Yes, the cow situation was a bit, longer than others, but
Yeah.
yeah, I find it remarkable. So I absolutely didn't want to say that this seemed like
Oh,
disjointed or it's
oh, not at
amazing. So
all,
I'm
not at
just curious.
all.
I'm just curious how you get drawn to all these projects.
I think with the cows, I certainly took a lot of advice from people. But in most cases, I think I have allowed myself to be guided by the animals themselves. So
Mm,
when it came to the donkeys and the equines in India, I started to notice that there was suddenly horse-drawn carts and donkey-drawn carts being reappearing on main roads, which they were previously banned and they were coming back, and there was this sudden presence again. And of course, I went down the line trying to understand why. In the case of the elephants, I really didn't originally want to start focusing on elephants when I started to focus on animals in geopolitical borders, mainly because, they're already an iconic species and are very, very widely researched and widely scrutinized. And then, the additional research focus that I bring in, I didn't want that to be an additional level of invasiveness of, of research itself. Um, but I think you're kind of drawn to you're motivated in significant part by what you see. And when I saw those three orphaned um, calves, and orphaned calves was such a strong feature of my previous
mm,
research, except that in this particular case, these orphan calves were going to grow and then they were going to sort of go through a process which no domesticated animal would go through in quite the same way. Domesticated animals are also trained, but this was going to, this was going to be a whole unparalleled level of exploitation that I felt I needed to understand better. So I think you're just drawn by
mm.
a sort of an emotional response. And for me, the orphan calves just called me back to elephants, though I was really planning to avoid the elephants.
No, it's
But
okay. I was at a conference not long ago where someone talked a lot about the orphan animal, how much even in our media, right, with like Bambi or all these other characters that are just like such a pull for almost
yeah.
anybody. So, um, but so before I kind of lean in maybe to other questions, I want to kind of give voice to some of the questions that we received from the audience. So there's a string of questions from Nicole, and I think they're really just asking questions about first if the orphan. The young elephant at the beginning who was severely injured, was it like a trap? A leg hold, or is it from kind of an injury sustained elsewhere? Was that found out? But I think I just want to not lump, but join these questions, which are really, that's just a question about that first elephant, but also with a lot of the practices they have, like using chains or other techniques. Is there really any way in which anything is meant to be at all pain reducing or discomfort reducing, or is it precisely the opposite?
Precisely the opposite. Precisely the opposite. It is to constantly keep them in a state of terror. The interesting thing about the pain reducing dimension is actually Ayurveda. So there's an entire um, entire body of Ayurveda, which is traditional Indian medicine, which is actually devoted to. So the only Ayurveda outside of human focus is the elephants. There's an elephant Ayurveda stream which was actually used to treat kumkis because it was under royal patronage that these elephants were the kumkis were captured and then beaten, and to treat those injuries, the Indian arm of elephant Ayurveda developed, right? So which is still being used today. So their medications are basically Ayurvedic medications, and And it's also very problematic, the kind of medications that they are given. But otherwise, all modes of training is 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 violent, and it is meant to induce pain. And this has again been a topic of discussion, because I was in an elephant seminar where there were elephant experts from elsewhere in the country. And it was interesting. Nobody actually raised it directly in the public seminars, but in their breakaway rooms, they would say, "Oh, we don't do this in our countries because we try and use more benign forms of training, reward-based training." Ultimately, reward-based training is a form of this. They would all inevitably it's a form of control and domination at the end of the day. But with the kumkis, violence is arguably, though, the most efficient way. Time efficient, labor efficient, and so violence is normative.
I appreciate what you said, and it's not necessarily a question I'll ask you as I'll move on, but what you said about ultimately about, say, reward-based training is, I think in numerous conversations I've shifted when people ask about the human-animal relations, I say, um, is it the very core, is it a relationship of domination? No matter anything else, is it necessarily one that? Because if we're going to talk about the way, is it necessarily one of control? Is it inherently that? And so I think you're talking about, yes. I mean, in this situation, it doesn't even seem like we're kind of under any kind of question. It seems like the goal, the purpose is to inflict that kind of pain for the sake of achieving certain ends. So it's misguided to kind of even ask about that. But I appreciate what you said, that even when you start to get into the weeds, the elephant grass about nicer, better practices. Really, fundamentally, we're still dealing with the same kind of relation.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I mean, there's reward-based training. For example, one of the points of comparison that comes up is African elephants, because African elephants are also, facing similar. I mean, Africa has a lot more land space and much more sparsely human populated. But African elephants do face similar challenges in terms of, losing their habitats. They're also extremely at high risk of poaching. So there is a lot of elephants in captivity in Africa. And yet they do not have a system of
Mm.
training elephants to be kumkis. And this immediately links back then to conservation practices themselves. They say that, Africa is savanna land. So they don't have that same level of, they don't have the canopies, they don't have the tall elephant grasses, they don't have as much of a fool safe poacher territory that South Asian forests do, right? So they said that necessarily we need elephants for conservation, whereas Africa can actually do fine with helicopters and drones. And because we're like, well, why can't we have drones in our forest? Why do we need elephants? And they're like, oh, the drones won't get into the forest because they're so thick. And and we always come back to the fact that, all right, that might be currently true of our current drones. But human intelligence is an exceptional thing, and we can surely come up with more imaginative and more perfect ways of of surveillance if for
Mm,
poaching, because they are very clear that the surveillance is for poaching. They're not surveilling the animals, they're surveilling for poachers, and smugglers and hunters.
mm.
Um, but this is a unique situation in South Asia where you need the elephants to protect the elephants.
Okay, so there's a question here from someone that says, are Kumki elephants trained in Assam or in other states, and are they only sent to Assam?
No, Kumki elephants are trained in every state. Kerala is a big elephant state. Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, Assam, West Bengal, and then you cross over to the border, and then you'll also find Kumkis in Bangladesh and Nepal. A lot of the trained elephants. So the mode of training elephants is similar for captive elephants used for commercial purposes, such as, for example, in temple processions, in marriage processions. Um, Circuses are banned, but then there's always underground entertainment, forms that are still operating. So there's a whole spectrum of commercial purposes that elephants are used for. But in what is distinctive about being trained as a Kumki elephant is that these elephants are trained to attack wild elephants and control wild elephants,
Mm.
because that's the human elephant hybrid, right? So these are ways to manage wild elephants. So the Kumkis are have an additional level of training, and of course they get into when when they're attacking wild elephants, they both elephants, kumkis as well as the wild elephants, get heavily injured. Huge amounts of physical violence just from infighting between elephants. So elephants are trained everywhere. The mahouts sometimes travel from one state to another, and which also, they say cause problems because an Assamese mahout will issue commands in Assam, and when he goes to Kerala and he has to speak in Malayalam, the elephant doesn't understand. More violence is used to try and train the elephants in multiple human languages, right? So and mahouts often do travel. So it's the human languages that are different, and then so the elephant goes through the same process of retraining again. The accent might be different. Elephant goes through the same process of retraining all over again, right? And oftentimes for a very brief period because that mahout might be replaced by someone else. So this is not a once-off process of breaking in. It is repeatedly a process of breaking in to not just a human command, but a human language, a human accent, a human behavior, etc.
Yes, I just really can't imagine given the intellectual capacity and just the intelligence of elephants, and I don't say that in any kind of hierarchical sense. I just mean given that reality, the kind of absolutely permanent fear and anxiety and stress they just must be living in at all times. I mean, we can understand that obviously with certain human populations around the world right now, what's happening in Palestine, Sudan, what's happening in many other places. But still,
Yeah.
it just makes me think of that. Like, what is it like as so many of us don't live under anything like that, which is constant state. And some of your images really brought that out. Again, I don't know how you do that, but the world definitely needs the work and the resolve that you bring to it. So let me pivot here. There's another question which asks, can you speak more to the differential attitudes of the vets and mahouts and others who work closely with the animals? Are their attitudes complicated by empathy, or have the elephants been subsumed into anthropocentric attitudes? I have heard cattle ranchers, for instance, insist that cows have no maternal instinct, which seems to serve their conscience in separating babies for dairy. But of course, we know this is not true about cows.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good question. So the vets that are so first of all, there are very few elephant vets, and the vets that are high that work for forest departments, that work for national parks, they're working for the national parks. They're not working for the elephants. They're working for the national park, right? So they are bureaucratically mandated to do what the national park requires. And the national park requires that captive elephants must be domesticated, must be controllable, because you can either be wild or you can be captive, but you cannot be an in-between, right? So in which case, if you're trying to release an elephant into the wild and they're going to keep coming back, you're going to have to break them. Okay. So the vets are the ones that oversee the Kumki training. Vets are the ones that also sometimes will have inputs on what additional forms of training a particularly resistant elephant might need to undergo for how long. They will determine which elephants, so which elephants are ready for Kumki training. So which are the calves that are ready for Kumki training. So vets are very much involved in Kumki training. Mahouts are interesting because mahouts are, of course, um, mahouts are the ones that are actually carrying on the physical act of training. Now mahouts are also the ones that look after these baby elephants, right? So mahouts will tell me that they will refuse to train the elephants that they have bottle fed because that would be too much of a betrayal. And that really would be too much of it almost seems visceral to even think of a mahout that has been bottle feeding the elephants to also now go and train them. So mahouts will usually train completely new elephants, and that's what they do. But mahouts have an interesting perspective, which are not, mahouts are within the forest department, they follow the lowest rung bureaucratically in terms of human staff hierarchies, right? They fall right at the bottom. There was a wild old elephant who had fallen over, and the vet was called, and I was accompanying him to see this one old elephant. And he refused to euthanize, which was not unexpected. but which also didn't seem as visceral as refusing to euthanize the baby elephant, because this was really, she had fallen over as a natural cause of old age. And she was probably she was going to have a few more hours, and she was on her way out. A JCB bulldozer was ready to bury, to once the elephant had died, to bury the old elephant. And the mahouts were really upset because they said she should really be put back into the forest. She wasn't euthanized, so she didn't have any poisons in her. She should really go back to feed the other animals in the forest. She should be go back to to be part of the forest food ecological system, and she shouldn't be buried. That made sense to me. They were really upset that this elephant was being buried, and of course, she was buried because that's what the bureaucrats had decided. So it's interesting that they do have certain views. They also get very upset about the fact that there's a constant turnover. So mahouts are constantly moved from one elephant to another. There's a few reasons for this, right? One is, because of course, the elephants get absolutely agitated because the one human being that they've got some type of a relationship with, who has, by the way, been very violent, has been part of their training, and which is why they listen to this particular human being. But for what it's worth, now they are used to this human being, and now they have to get used to someone else. Elephants actually get very agitated when their mahouts change. Mahouts are constantly changed because they have to go on leave. Sometimes they fall sick. There's a whole range of reasons why mahouts might not be available to the elephant 24/7. So, but then someone needs to be with the elephant 24/7. So while the ideal practice is to have two elephants dedicated to one elephant, two humans dedicated to one elephant, the high turnover means that they are constantly changing elephants, and the mahouts get very upset because they think that they also get attached. They also feel a sense of accountability. They worry about how this elephant is going to do with the new mahout, whether he understands the nuances, whether he understands their little, we all understand little things about the animals that we live with. We understand, without them making big physical displays, we can still try and read some of the nuances of their body language. And the mahouts worry that these things are no longer going to be possible. Possibly with the new mahout, he's going to miss a fuller care for the elephants. So they are able to care. They do worry in these types of ways, but they are also very much bound by the bureaucratic requirements of training elephants to become kumkis. So it's a particular type of dynamic that they are also entrapped in, and they are paid very, very low rates of money. So for them to do this kind of work, um, there's also financial coercion that drives them to do this type of work, as people in slaughterhouses,
Mm.
etc.
It's really interesting and kind of I think important. And so like I think in the last like 5, 10 minutes that we'll spend here, I actually do want to pivot to these kinds of um, not maybe these kind of micro moments in this phenomenon, but some of these overarching themes that you talked about, and especially with the spotlighting and the kind of violence. You said like this young male um, anger and violence. And so I'm just curious because in all of your work, or at least most of your work, they're like kind of like patriarchy is kind of just like under all of it. And I think it's kind of a buzzword now, but I don't know. Do we have many things, anything older than patriarchy? Um, and I think sometimes. Um, and I just would like you to maybe could speak a little bit more about how much you see this at work in the kind of, we could say maybe even ultra violence that is directed at these animals, because I think it has to be that big because everything else is already violent. Everything else might already be ultra violent, but it's a kind of ultra violence. And how does that interweave with things like employment, wages, frustration, um, grappling with maybe traditional notions of masculinity. How palpable do you see that in all of this work?
There's one story, a very, very short, very quick story that I'm going to tell you, which demonstrates just how palpable this is. Now, there's a lot in the animal studies literature, Dinesh Vadivel's beautiful work on animal resistance, right? So when an animal resists, um, that is political,
Hmm.
because resistance is a political expression. But how do people who are actually dealing with resisting animals see this? Because they don't see that as resistance. But what they see it as, the words that were used to describe resisting elephants who, resist training, who resist control, was arrogance, right?
Mm.
It's an arrogant elephant. So, and one vet, forest department vet, had come up with this very neat or mathematical equation to to figure out how arrogant an elephant is. So he had come up with something that he called a command compliance ratio. So he said, if I have to command an elephant once and the elephant obeys right away, that's an obedient elephant. That's a good elephant because command compliance ratio is 1 on 1. And if I have to command an elephant 10 times, increasingly more violent, and then finally the elephant obeys because by the 10th time the violence is too much, that's an arrogant elephant because it's the elephant is refusing obedience, refusing compliance. So that was really interesting because he talked about the fact that, and his views, the way he was describing it was very, very reminiscent of older forms of patriarchal training within humans. Like, you got to be an obedient child, you got to be an obedient wife, or you got to be an obedient, whatever your human designated role is. It was very similar. He in fact used certain parallels from human examples to demonstrate that it's not that different for elephants. And resistance is not resistance, but resistance is arrogance. You're just being arrogant in when you're refusing to listen. So the command compliance ratio has become this informal way of
Did
of,
you
of
hear that
assessing.
kind of language even among mahouts? Would they kind of use similar, like the notion of I say that is because it reminds me of ways in which especially men who have privilege will say things like people need to know their place, know your place, right? This is
Yeah.
typical. But I feel like the lower you are on the economic ladder, the less you feel empowered to use that language. But I guess probably men have been saying that to women no matter their economic state. So I'm just kind of curious, does it have a kind of class stratification in that language as well?
They will constantly use the language that the vets use.
Oh,
And
okay, I see.
because this is very much part of the mahout training too,
Mm,
right? Because the mahouts are trained to become mahouts, and the mahouts are broken in as well.
I see.
So the process of training a Kumki elephant they'll oftentimes use new mahouts. They'll actually use that as an opportunity to train new mahouts. So it's not necessarily experienced mahouts that break the elephants, but it's new ones. So it's a process of breaking in for the mahout as much as for the elephant. So they will absorb the language. I mean, if you are so to speak broken in, they will absorb and they will recycle and reuse the same type of language that they will hear veterinarians using, for example. That doesn't mean that they don't deviate. That they will often express frustration that we know this elephant and you're making the wrong decision for this elephant. Bureaucratically, there'll be a top-down order because it's such a colonial system, it's such a bureaucratic top-down system. There'll be an order that comes for this particular elephant to, um, a decision will come to move them or to put them under a more intensive captivity. And the mahouts are like, you don't even know this elephant. You don't know this individual. So these are the ways in which they themselves become deviant, right? And I think these are the little fissures of possibility that need some probing because there is a certain level of uh, I mean, it's very difficult to talk about entanglement between humans and elephants as though, they have both experienced the same exact
Hmm.
type of oppression. Um, but there are also certain types of ways in which that layering occurs, and I think these fissures open both in terms of elephant deviancy, deviancy being a word for their agency,
Yeah,
and
exactly.
also mahout deviancy.
Well, this is fascinating. I get so tempted. There's so many other t parts of this you brought up. I think the notion of, right, the wild animal, and does the wild even exist anymore? or will it ever exist again is kind of this lingering question. But I think we'll pause because it'll get too big. And also it's actually quite coincidental because in a month's time, in our second talk, Emilia Leese is actually going to give a talk about rewilding. I think
Oh,
this is mostly in
fantastic.
the UK. And
Yeah.
I think it's a very fascinating topic. And it also, you mentioned Dinesh Wadiwal. I remember when Dinesh was giving a talk and I asked him a question. This is maybe a decade ago or less. I said, are we just heading to a world without animals? Like from both sides of the equation, is everyone just pushing to a world without animals? The activists who want to eliminate the breeding and the tons of animals in these systems, and then the elimination of the wild. So I
Mm.
think between this talk and next talk, we'll kind of have a lot of interesting perspectives on this matter. But to close, Yamini, just unbelievable work. It is an honor to kind of host you and have you as a colleague and friend. And I know we're all looking forward to what comes next from your work.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you again for offering a platform for my work. Again, Jonathan, and especially for this one, which is really, raw and deviant in its own way. Particularly, it hasn't been disciplined into polished research yet. So this is truly raw and wild research. So
Wonderful.
thank you
Thank you.
for offering this a platform.
Wonderful. So thank you all for being here. We will see you again
Thank
March
you, everyone
16th
else.
on 2026 for our next talk in the series with Amelia Lease, Letting Nature Lead, Lessons for Our Ecosystems and Our Lives. Once again, thank you, Yamini, and we will see you soon.
Thank you. Thanks,
Bye,
Jonathan. Thank
everyone.
you, everyone. Bye.